Central Asia as a region remains widely unknown. However, there's a lot more to this region than just a Russian area of influence. Its connections with medieval Khorasan, present-day Afghanistan, South Asia, Iran, and wider Middle East deserve more attention. While teaching, I come across different questions stemming from absolute detachment of youth from medieval history of this region. In this series of podcasts, we try to bridge this gap. To begin this series, I have invited a friend, a colleague, a senior historian, a researcher on Mongol history, Professor Michael Bechtel. We have discussed about different aspects of Mongol history and its legacy for Central Asia. Recently, I visited Bishkek for a conference, and during the conference, there was this discussion about what certain Central Asian historians do. And the speaker, who was political scientist with expertise on Central Asia, was criticizing historians for doing medieval history, which is very distant from current affairs, and somehow he was arguing that medieval history is irrelevant and we should not study it and we should do something more like contemporary history. And I was looking at the audience that most of them were nodding positively, and I thought, this is, of course I disagreed with him, but somehow it reminds me of the general discussions, even among other disciplines, about history and medieval history, particularly the chapter on Mongol Empire. What's your take on that? Because it's really interesting to have your opinion on that discussion.
Well, I'll start by saying that here, especially in Central Asia, medieval history is with us today. I mean, when we talk about Genghis Khan, the Mongols, anything else, it pervades at least this sort of a popular culture idea of history, right? I mean, it's easy to fill classrooms on the Mongol Empire because everyone here has some connection, right? They see this kind of connection, but on a more from a like professional historian's perspective, to me, I've been thinking about this a long time. I teach medieval history, and so one of the questions that we have to answer, all historians have to answer, is who cares? Right? Why does this matter? And so, it's easy to maybe find an answer, easier than other places to find an answer to that here in Central Asia. Why does it matter? Because we're surrounded by descendants of, the Mongols. And but that's not enough, right? So we look at, when you think about this, to me, we have to see a continuum. Yes, there are perhaps more immediate solutions, more immediately obvious solutions to recent history, but often, particularly in Western study of history, we start understanding the pre-modern period with colonialism. Like colonialism fell out of the sky fully hatched and landed here on Earth and took over everything. But when in fact, especially here in Central Asia, colonialism is as much a reaction to what existed here as it was something that came from outside. And what was here? Well, the Mongols, at least a Chingisid idea of authority, right? This is one of the great things that last for so long. I don't mean great and good, but one of the great inventions of the Mongols that existed far longer than anything we could call a Mongol Empire, even a Mongol state, frankly. It's this idea of Chingisid authority, that those who have the right to rule have to be descended from Genghis Khan. And that was the dominant idea of authority when our expanding colonial empires arrived here, in a way. Right? So, I mean, for one step, the first step in responding to something like that, I think, is this idea that, you can keep going back farther and farther. But of course, in Central Asia, the Mongols are such a presence.
For me, and I'm sure for most students and people who are interested in history of Central Asia, they are probably wondering, how did Genghis Khan or the Mongols emerge as a group in the 12th or 13th century? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure.
About especially the timing, how, the existence of two agrarian or or sedentary, Khanids, whether it was the Seljuks and the Kharakhanids, and then you see a group emerging in the northern neighbors. How do they? Is it really coinciding with the emergence of Mongol as an ethnic group, or also that they didn't have the notion of being Mongol back then?
Right.
Yeah.
All right, several things there. One, it ties directly to the first issue about this. Why do we study this medieval history, right? I mean, we're looking at one of the reasons that you see these street names and this kind of reaching back into that past is a search for identity, right? I mean, we are in the period of nation states, post-Soviet nation states in Central Asia, a time when that immediate identity of Soviet has been lost, and that there's this attempt to reconnect to that identity, and they're looking back at exactly this time period, right? Where what is the beginning? What's the origin of us? How do we define us? And if you're looking for origin of major change in Central Asia, then 13th century and a man named Temujin is the place to look, right? Yeah. But before I talk about Temujin, about Genghis Khan, I think that recognizing this existence, like you just mentioned, of agrarian states and pastoral nomadic peoples, right? I think that in a lot of the study of Central Asia, historical study of Central Asia, more is made of this issue than is necessary. Agriculturalist versus pastoralist. However, there is a relationship there, and one based on difference. For a long period before the 13th century, let's take China, for example. The long series of rulers of China looked to the north as the source of a threat and the source of a potential weapon. Right? There are two things that they wanted to do. One was to keep those northern pastoral nomads from uniting. They thought that would be bad. Turns out they were right. But the other idea is, of course, that these are powerful warriors. How do we use them? Right? How do we employ them in
against
a useful
our rivals,
way?
Yeah.
That's right, against others. So there existed for a long period that spanned several ruling regimes, a policy of interference, right? Awarding them titles, playing them against one another to maintain instability in this region. But when we get to the Mongols specifically, scholars love to talk about this period. There are many factors that seem to have come to a nexus in this end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th, that allowed for something like Genghis Khan and the Mongols to appear. Everything is discussed, from the sort of degeneration of the Jin, climate change, the appearance of this particular man, Temujin, with a set of ideas, the right man at the right time in the right place. Whatever happened here, it was the case that, in fact, Temujin was able to unite these peoples of the Mongolian plateau into a singular force. Right? He was able to bring them together in a way that had not been done in recent memory, right? In a way that made them a powerful military, and, because, again, of his particular characteristics, political.
How did they do it? And did he use, for example, language, religion, or any other tools to unite these different tribes which were not united before?
All right. If we're going to talk about Temujin before he becomes Genghis Khan, like Temujin before the world knew about him, right? Temujin on the Mongolian plateau, it is a mixture of political alliance and, I mean, it's a bit hard to apply our categories of what we would consider political power to what's going on there. But in some ways, he was a man who had a hereditary claim to authority. Right? We might call him like a nomadic aristocracy. Right?
Okay.
He was born into a family that was traditionally. However, because of that, his father was assassinated, murdered. and his family abandoned. So, this perfect Joseph Campbell story of the hero, he goes from being destitute to, what we all know as Genghis Khan. But in that period, he turned out to be a very good strategist, one who appears to have understood the distribution of power and how to recognize talent outside of heredity. Right. That though he was part of this hereditary elite himself, one of the things that's often mentioned, one of the things we have a source for, the only source, the secret history, a source produced by the Mongols themselves, seems to indicate that he promoted talent, regardless of its origin. And he was able to turn a small group of people who had a particular set of talents, a young gang of boys, frankly, who achieved a level of success that allowed them to continue building on that success. And so by the time he's Genghis Khan and the several conflicting groups of people on the Mongolian plateau are united under this guy, his boyhood friends are still in power. So he's created not an unprecedented form of power, right? Even Alexander the Great had a similar kind of, I believe the term is comitatus, this basically a loyal group of followers who then become political leaders. But a combination of factors, again, due to the military technology. I mean, when we're talking about 13th century military technology, we've got the horse, the recurve bow. I mean, they have stirrups, but that's not new at this point. And other kinds of technologies like organization, right? He develops a kind of military that in its immediate environment, that is neighbors with the Jin, is an overwhelming military force. And so once he joins these people together, and from my perspective, my point of view, is that Temujin's great accomplishment in his career comes before anyone else ever heard of him, right? I mean, that is basically, Temujin becomes Genghis Khan in 1206 as a reward for what, from Temujin's point of view, was the highlight of his career, that is uniting most of the peoples of the Mongolian plateau. It's what happens after that.
Can we draw a kind of connection between the people who are living in Mongolia and, connecting with the Mongols of the 13th century, or are they entirely different group?
No, they are indeed, in a way, an entirely different group, but of course this has to do with their success. We talk about Genghis Khan in that period. They're called Mongols simply because he's a Mongol, right? This is a Mongol confederation. It is a practice that people who are joined under leadership, they take on the name of those. So this is where we have Mongols, right? This is not yet anyway, an ethnic group. Right? We have a kind of political organization of many different kinds of people. It is this development of hereditary, and over generations, we form this identity of we might call today an ethnicity, right? One of our problems with ethnicity is that it's partially based on biological descent, right? And that's a relatively new way to think about ethnicity, right? So in a way, we have this connection to this original group of Mongols, this Genghis Khan and the confederated peoples under him, descendants of that group, or what we might call Mongolians today, or Mongols today.
And one of the names that pops up in Central Asian history is the Mughulistan Khanate, which is a replacement for Chaghataid Khanate. The connection that they had with the Juchid, for example, you see that Haydar Dawlat is referring to them as Mughulistan,
That's right.
and basically showing that not all of them were called Mughal, or the Chaghataids probably were calling themselves Chaghataid or the Chaghataid state, and the Juchids were Juchids, and the Ilkhanids had a different form of identity probably developed later on. So that's why, do you think the Mongolia, the word borrows from the Mughulistan Khanate, or is it?
No, I think we're still reaching further back. I think that this brings up an interesting issue about this sense of self-identity amongst this sort of this middle period. I mean, we're basically talking about 8 centuries
Yeah.
of this, since Genghis Khan. And in the middle of that period, we have Mongols who are the ruling elite all over Eurasia. And yet they are not a single group of ruling elite. Right? We have, just as you said, we have Chaghataids, we have Juchids, we have the Tuluids. And these people share an affinity for a particular idea of authority.
Yeah.
They share an origin, but beyond that, there's very little that they share as a common identity. Right? They sort of police one another. If someone violates this idea of affinity for Chingisid authority, they will impose that, they will correct it in their neighbors. But yet we don't see them calling themselves Mongols as a group, right? They're not, excuse me, they're not identifying themselves collectively. Right? They're all, again, they share an origin. So, it is useful in this period of nation states to reach back and find a unified identity. And, this is a common story, of course.
But outside of Central Asia, for example, some Indian historians are referring to Central Asian as the entirety as Mongols. See that, who doesn't, regardless of their origin, whether they are Tajik or Uzbek or whatever groups, when they were traveling to India, they were simply calling them Mughal. The Timurids rulers of India were also referred to as Mughals, regardless of their different origins. The fact that they had war and conflict with the Chaghataid back then, they are still considered by outsiders as Mongols. So,
That's right.
so it looks like the word Mughal back then had a different meaning than it has
from the outside, no doubt. I mean, seems as much cultural as anything else, geographic, right?
Yeah. So it's like imposing or like projecting the identity of the ruling group over the entire population, something like that.
Which isn't entirely irrelevant.
Yeah.
If we think back to Genghis Khan's
It's happened
time,
a lot.
that's right. I mean, in Genghis Khan's time, they would have called themselves Mongols because they were united in this. So, in a way, that kind of projection onto the Mongols, many things are projected onto the Mongols. I'm sure we'll get to other aspects of this, but certainly in that period, others looked from the outside looking in. They're one undifferentiated mass. These people are.
Yeah. So glad that you brought the other aspects of the Mongol Empire, especially the stereotypes and kind of fixed image of the Mongol conquest of Khwarazm and Mawara and Iran. Reading from Turkic and Persian perspective, it was the Mongol conquest was always associated with the massacres and genocides and destructions, and it is always remembered as the dark part of history of these nations. But I'm sure there's more than that. We did discuss about this issue. Can you elaborate a little bit more? How did the Mongol conquest of Central Asia took place, and of course further south in the conquest of Iran?
Yeah. Well, no doubt, the sort of horror created in the contemporary period of the Mongol expansion was in many ways justified. The Mongols really did do some of those things, right? And the massacres of entire city populations, or this awful way of gathering up the peasants to fill the moat so that they could reach the city. But yet, the thing is that when we're talking about the Mongols at any time, popular imagination is unavoidable. I mean, the thing about what we're doing here is that anyone who hears this knows a little bit about what we're talking about, right? You can say the name of Genghis Khan anywhere in the world, and people know this name, right?
Yeah.
And so that comes with this kind of popular interest in the Mongols, and of course, with popular interest come not always an exaggeration, but an emphasis on the dramatic, right? The dramatic, the violent, these kinds of things. The problem with the Mongols is that that's not wrong, right? It is accurate. However, the Mongols were a very small group of people. who somehow, I mean, the way that we look at it from the outside is that somehow they managed to take this very small group of people, savages from the steppe, and to establish this rule over the most civilized,
Complicated.
that's
and
right,
complex,
societies on the planet
states,
at the
yeah.
time, right? So, the fascination with that leads us to say, well, how? Well, extreme violence is one of the answers, right? They employed savagery and extreme violence in order to accomplish this. Looking carefully at sources and reading what the Mongols were actually doing, right? The Mongols were very practical. Pragmatic might be a better explanation. That is, they adopted any kind of institution, social construct, technology, anything that helped them to reach their goals, they adapted to. They absorbed it. That pragmatism extends to the avoidance of conflict in many cases. Right? Mongols never fought a fair fight. I mean, fair fights, if it's 50-50, those odds aren't good enough, right? They had the advantage of mobility and speed, so often they fought in ways that gave them the advantage, right? So that they were guaranteed victory. They did have terrible massacres of entire cities. But reading closely what leads up to this, it's often resistance, right? The Mongols come knocking on the gate and say, I'm sure you've heard of us, we're here to take over. This can go several ways. The best for you is to
surrender.
That's right. Give us your leadership. We'll replace it with our own and we'll go away.
Yeah.
However, if you don't, we're going to make an example of this city so that the next time we knock on the gate, we'll get the response we want. Part of the fact that they're a small group can be related to the violence that we see in some of these conquests. The Mongols didn't like to go back. Right? Once they've conquered, taken control of a region, a subsequent rebellion would lead to one of these instances.
And suppression. Yeah.
That's right. I mean, as horrible as it is to think about, it can be classified as propaganda, right? I mean, they're sending a message in a way that is sort of repulsive for us to think. This is why in the popular interest, this is why it gets so much.
I've been hearing also some comments from historians. Sometimes they are coming up with this theory that the Mongols invented violence, and they believed in violence, and that's why they were so effective in ruling over such a vast territory. But as you mentioned, it looks like they were not really a firm believer in violence. But then somehow it maintained the fear that people could and should not resist against the Chingisid rule.
It worked.
It worked. Yeah. So, and that also brings me to the next, debate or discussion, which is often related to the Mongol history, is that somehow we also witness that the actual disappearance of Mongols from the literature. Like somehow we talk about the Turkified Mongols Turkified Mongol rulers of Central Asia. We do not refer to Shibanids as Mongols, but as Turks.
Right.
Similarly, about Tuqay-Timurids as Turks, and the ones which moved further south in Iran, Iranian historians believe that they became Persianized. So probably a similar thing happened to the Ogaday descendants ruling over Yuan and Song dynasty. So, to what extent this perspective, which comes from Turkic scholars and Persian scholars, is really historical and correct?
Well, I think it's not unrelated to this idea about what their self-perception of identity, right? That indeed we do sort of see perhaps a dilution of this Mongol identity, but consequence of success, I might have to say. That one of the things, of course, not unique to the Mongols, is that in order to establish legitimacy as rulers over a conquered people, you must, part of one of the things you must do is to make their existing elite part of your ruling structure. You, in order to win the hearts and minds, you must...
You become like people.
That's right. Well, and of course, after a few generations, the Mongols really are as much genetically and culturally a part of the people they have conquered as they are of Genghis Khan's people, original group of people, right? There's a reason that Mongolians today share so many physical and cultural common characteristics with Chinese. They were there for a century, right? And what did they do? These rulers were marrying into the population. This is happening everywhere for Mongols, right? Another aspect of this is that, one of the things we might think about, and why might they have retained a unique identity, would be a sense of unity, right? A sense of an overarching Mongol world, right? That goes from the east all the way into Western Eurasia, right? That this is what belongs to us. But in fact, what seems to be better explained by the sources is that in fact there is no unified identity or even a concept of a single ruling structure. Again, we see successor states or, several states with a common origin and affiliation for Chingisid authority. But the fact is, these are separate peoples. I would argue that even within the third generation, by the time we get to Ogadei, right, the son of Genghis Khan, even his children are ruling separate empires. I guess technically the way we think about empire, each of them would be a separate empire.
Establishing their own clan or their own, kind of a state.
That's right. They're turning from a centralized rule to regional rule, which again, going back to this theme of pragmatism amongst Mongols, is far more efficient and makes more sense. If you don't have a ideological goal. Right? If the Mongols aren't trying to impose Chingisid rule over the world, or religious belief, or cultural practice, if in fact what they're interested in is what I and other scholars argue, what they're interested in is the local enrichment, right? They're not interested in creating a global empire, right? At least nothing we have seems to indicate that that's what they want. Later generations who claim descent from, you see someone like Timur, right? Emir Timur is trying to recreate this Mongol Empire. In his own words, he's reestablishing this. So this idea of a change in identity is it's hard. We're dealing with two things here. One is what they thought themselves, what were their intentions, how did they perceive this, and then us trying to figure out where did they go, what happened to them culturally, what happened to this idea. This idea of Chingisid descent never changes. Okay, it remains, of course.
So it looks like the Mongols, presents a different example of grouping or sense of grouping, which is not based on language or religion, because Chingisids were practicing different religion and speaking different languages and were ruling over different territories. So you're right about this issue that that we should not really talk about them as a kind of like homogeneous group, but as a group which transformed in different geographies. And that's also the story of identity formation and the group making different practices across different regions. Maybe it's more of modernist approach, or the contemporary approach that we think of identity as something rooted in particular blood or language or culture or religion. But in the case of Mongols, as you mentioned, we should not fall into that trap by really associating them with a particular language or religion. True?
Yeah, this issue about what makes a Mongol is something that kind of goes throughout. Because not only are we dealing with already a group of people who don't quite fit our assumptions about identity, right? So much of what we think about identity is, frankly, kind of new. Our concepts of, this comes with nation states, post-colonialism, looking for identity, in these shared origins, shared experiences, language, culture, this sort of thing. But looking at the Mongols, they defy many of this kind of categorization. Even in those early generations, they're already speaking different languages. They are absorbing whatever is useful from the people they encounter. And part of the explanation for that is perhaps they're also, again, a challenge to the way we generally analyze peoples of the past. They're not driven by some shared religious ideology or some kind of binding quality that, aside from that thing I keep mentioning, Genghis Khan and this method of authority. But indeed, they begin to branch off into many different categories early. But it's also evolving within what we would call the Mongols, this idea of identity. Some of them are, in fact, within a few generations, trying to reach back and claim a kind of shared identity. They're beginning to, we're aiming at a moving target, right? Trying to figure this out. That as we begin to unpack what it meant to be Mongol in Genghis Khan's time, by the time we're talking about what it meant to be a Mongol in his grandchildren's time, it's something different, right there. And even if we look at the sources they're producing by, say, Rashid ad-Din, written in the beginning of the 14th century or finished in the beginning of the 14th century, we're seeing a kind of claim to identity that doesn't seem to quite line up with what we know about Temujin, Genghis Khan, this idea. They're creating a new mythology for themselves, right? And they're all doing that in different ways. The Tuluids in Yuan, China are developing this idea that they are a traditional Chinese dynasty. You read the Yuan-shi, this history. Genghis Khan is a Chinese emperor. The dynasty begins with Genghis Khan. So you see this branching out, this evolution of the past. Right? The past is always changing, none more so than the time of the Mongols. Right? So that idea about what unites them, it's not language, it's not cultural practice, certainly not religion. It's frankly very little that keeps them united. There are some important exceptions, but yeah.
But some cases when I'm, for example, studying Shahrasabs and the equation of Chingisid of Shahrasabs, which were Chingisids, and then or Mongol, and their connection with the Manghits of Bukhara, which were also Turkified Mongols, and they were fighting each other, and sometimes they are not considering themselves as part of the same group, and they have this certain ideas about who they are, in the fragmentation. Maybe that also shows the fragmentation of Mongol identity, and the fact that that when Soviets came to establish different nations in Central Asia, they did not consider Mongols as one of the ethnic groups which exist in Central Asia, but really kept it within Mongolia rather than a group outside of Mongolia. And it's also reminding reminding me of the speech that one of the Mongolian ambassador to Kazakhstan had recently had at Nazarbayev University, that when he was asked a question why Mongolia is not part of the Turkic nations, he said, we're not a Turkic nation. That's as simple as that. And that also shows that the complexity of identity formation, that part of the group which remains in Mongolia is not assimilating into the neighboring culture, and the ones which are ruling over the neighboring culture finds a kind of equilibrium to assimilate maybe, or to adjust their identity, adapt their identity to make themselves look like local rather than a foreign group.
Yeah, one of the responses to this, though, is that in fact they are the local group as
Yeah.
much as they are Mongol,
Yeah.
if not more,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we're talking about, these later Ilkhanids are more Persian than they're
Yeah,
Mongol, right?
true.
And so when we're talking about this identity, if we look at it from their perspective, take one of these Ilkhanid rulers, they claim descent from Genghis Khan, and indeed they have that bloodline. But if we really looked at their genetic makeup,
Yeah,
the
it's
fact is
definitely,
they're mostly Persian,
Yeah.
right? They're not, they choose Mongol,
Yeah.
right? They choose that identity.
for a reason.
That's right. But they are a product of their
Yeah,
environment,
Of course.
right? And so,
So similar, like to Sayyids,
right.
they were Persianized and they're speaking Persian and they're living among this, the Turkic groups and Persians and Indians, but they still claim to be Sayyid.
Yep.
Probably it'd be because it just benefits them or keep them in power, or somehow it's source of, it's like a source of wealth and human
that's right.
capital. You don't want to lose it because
Well, they cannot, right? And in these cases, that
people look up to them.
that connection to Genghis Khan is their access to authority. I
Yeah.
mean, the reason that they rule is this
Yeah.
connection. So indeed, we can't downplay that connection
Yeah.
to the Chingisid line, but yet, Ibn Khaldun has that theory that the first generation are conquerors,
Yeah.
the second generation enjoys the fruits of that conquest, the third generation are the conquered. Right? They become part of who they conquered, and it's the measure of success when you're conquered by someone else that you've been so successful you've become that which you conquered. And so for the Mongols, this is as true as anyone else, right?
Yeah.
That this is what's going on. But
does it also relate to their pragmatism in the fact that they were not really stubborn about keeping certain things which were according to them not really necessary, but keeping the most important elements of their
Right.
identity intact, like some of the Mongols even became Persian poets later on when they adopted this idea that that they are part of this Persianate society, that Mirza Abdul Qadir Bidil, for example, who is one of the Mongols that became really well known in India, and he's celebrated as Persian poet, but he's
right,
a Mongol.
this issue is sort of perfectly exemplified by the conflict between two of Genghis Khan's grandsons, their brothers. We're talking about Kublai, son of Tului, and Sorakaktani Beki, and his younger brother, Arakbokha, who is also the son of Tului and Sorakaktani Beki.
Yeah.
Both of them, at one time, have themselves claimed to be the Khan, the great Khan, the successor to rule over whatever is left of a unified empire. But the division between them is based on many things, but largely it's based upon this disagreement about what we, the Mongols, are to become. Are we going to be Chinese emperors like Kublai and his followers want to be? Or are we going to be pastoral nomads like Arakbokha and his followers want to be? So there was this kind of, to overemphasize it a bit, a divide between these traditionalists and these modernists, let's say, or these people who are who's saying, look, the real power here is to rule, not to conquer. Right? Others are saying, but we're Mongols, we conquer, right? We live in the steppe. We don't. They accuse Kublai of partaking of too many comforts, of all of this, and indeed Kublai was doing that. But so we see this division, right? What does it mean to be Mongol? You have to act Mongol, right? Kublai kept a ger, a yurt, in the palace grounds in China that he, occasionally reportedly slept in to keep his connection. But I mean, this was not his.
But it looks like they somehow some of them kept this idea, the idea of belonging to the white ones, and to preserve their identity, despite the fact that they were marrying into different groups and they were mixing with other groups. They still preserved based on male lines.
That's right.
Like,
That's right.
here, I mean, it's maybe from a female perspective or feminist perspective. If you look at it, it's going to be a bit different, as you mentioned. That they mix with other groups, so they are not pure Mongol anymore. So they adapted to different cultures and different languages and different religions. But yeah, maybe the idea that of being Aksyak and so there's some Central Asians even argue that whenever, for example, Kazakhs have some tension with Uzbeks, they play the Aksyak rather than
this connection to the reaching back, and it's true. The same thing happening with the Mongols. I mean, those who grow up to be rulers were once children of their mothers, right? And they absorb as much of their identity, if not more of their identity, from their mothers than they do from this idea about what gives them access to authority. Right? And we occasionally see this resurgence of Mongol identity, and that's mostly when it's totally absent.
What about the descendants of female children of Genghis Khan? Did they also claim to be Chingisid? For example, daughters of Genghis Khan who married into other groups? And
they can be Chingisid, right? It becomes more complex as time passes, not surprisingly.
Yeah.
That descendants does not have to be through male line. Right? It can be in others, but within a couple of generations, we're talking about a playing field of thousands of Chingisids.
Yeah.
And so, this is how we get things like the Kazakh Khanate. Johnny Bacon Gire, they're like 14th in line for making a claim to the Khanate. They're never going to be Khans. They simply leave.
What surprised me the most was the one of the emirs of Bukhara, like Amir Sayyid Haidar, which is like from maternal side, Chingisid. The father married, Shamran married daughter of the Abul Faiz, the last Chingisid ruler of Bukhara, and he used the title of Tura and Sayyid for being. Which is very very interesting.
A collapse of all of these ideologies into a single
it's really
claim.
interesting. It's not this different type of Sayyid, which is through the Chingisid line, not through the Prophet line. So one thing which I believe is really underplayed when it comes to the Mongol rule over Central Asia and the vast Muslim world, Islamic world, is the the Chingisid idea of religion or religious pluralism, something which can be associated with modern day secularism or pragmatic approach towards religion and religious diversity. Can we talk a little bit more about their idea of religious diversity?
Yeah, this is a particularly difficult topic because often it's Genghis Khan's religious tolerance is pointed out, and that seems to me to be an inaccurate way to think about it. That's our way of thinking about this sort of religious approach to religion, religious belief. But the fact is, I think it's religious irrelevance, frankly, from this early Mongol point of view. Maybe we could start with their own religious beliefs. We use this word Tengrism today, a common way to describe traditional religion in Central Asia, particularly here in Kazakhstan. But that we apply that onto Genghis Khan and in his time, and it's not quite accurate. It's not they would not have understood the concept of religion, that my beliefs are somehow on par with Buddhism and Islam and Christianity, and we just choose which of these we want. It's much like, say, Hinduism, which is less a religion than a pantheon of belief, right? Where, I've heard Hindu scholars talk about, religious scholars talk about, how Christianity is one of the great ways, fits in Hinduism, even in Buddhism. Right? So it's more like this idea that there's a set of traditional beliefs. William of Rubric, one of these people who traveled to visit the Mongols, he was trying to convert Mongols to Christianity. Yeah. And they simply didn't understand him. Right? They didn't understand how he could make them Christian. They weren't Christian, they were Mongol,
Yeah.
right? Because to them, Christians were an ethnic group. It had nothing to do with their religious belief. It wasn't like
Yeah.
a set of beliefs that was transferable. To
Yeah.
them, this was who we are. We can't.
Yeah.
So when
So a
we
Mongol had to preserve his identity by not converting to another religion or something like that.
Well, I wouldn't even say that. In fact, conversion amongst Mongols was not an issue. They didn't care. I mean, we have as early as Berke, that is the brother of Batu, the older
Yeah.
brother of Batu, grandson of Genghis Khan,
Yeah.
converting to Islam.
Yeah.
Right? But no one gave him any trouble for that. That was
Yeah.
not an issue because your personal beliefs had nothing to do with our Mongol enterprise, our rule.
But it looks like at that time in Central Asia, people were not that open, probably. If I'm not saying about people, but maybe, the elites were not that open-minded about, people practicing different religions. It looks like, the Samanids tried to promote one religion, and the Karakhanids were also promoting Sunni, interpretation of Islam. I mean, they were aware that the general population are looking for some sort of, notion of unified religion. But somehow the Chingisid rule did preserve a level of religious diversity, a level of religious pluralism, or maybe even the absence of religious rule or theocracy for a period of time really helped people to find their own corner and then do not practice, at least the option of not practicing Islam.
Yeah, they weren't
Looked
imposing
feasible.
one of those.
Yeah.
It seems clear that early on Mongols understood this conflict in religions. In fact, even under there's a story about Kublai hosting a debate between different religious beliefs, and I know this in the Ilkhanid realm they did the same. And to them this was interesting, but they didn't have a horse in the race. So they didn't, at least not at the beginning. But of course, again, back to this identity that they become the people that they conquer. Eventually, they do have this. You've got this. I think it's Ghazan. Ilkhanid. He converts several times. He goes from Sunni to Buddhist to Nestorian to Shia. He goes through this. He's searching for his spiritual home, right?
Yeah.
And so that brings in this question about conversion, and applied specifically here to Mongols, but it's a bigger issue about conversion of elites.
Yeah.
Is this a move to make it easier to rule, or is this personal? Right? I mean, in the case of Ghazan, we could say, well, look, he's clearly following his own path here. But when conversion becomes permanent and expected, we see exactly what you're talking about here. We see that under the Mongols in Islamic world, Islam does become dominant because the Mongols are Muslim, right? And they begin, it takes a while, but they begin to...
At the time of Uzbek Khan.
That's right. That's right. They begin to favor their own choice of religion, their own choice of belief.
But can we also say that Uzbek Khan made sure that the nomadic groups, especially the Juchid party, the Uzbekullos at least, convert entirely to Islam? Or do we also, the documents, do we get to read that maybe it was not that popular to... Or it was not that necessary to be part of the Uzbekullos in order to convert to Islam?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's been some looks at this about whether or not this was a top-down conversion. Right?
Yeah.
Are you forced to be? And my understanding of that debate is that it's still undecided. Partly because we don't have sources about this level of, you get below a certain level of elite, and none of the chroniclers are interested in them, right? And but eventually, I mean, we talked about Islam earlier. About Islam, at least before the Mongols, was not something we could easily classify as simply religion. I mean, simply religion, but that Islam was the whole package. It was a hierarchy of authority. It was ruling institutions. It was social institutions. It was cultural. It was linguistic. Islamic civilization is the right way to explain this pre-Mongol, and that after
that
the Mongols,
changed.
and then, there's a very acute moment in which,
Yeah.
Hulagu executes the Abbasid Caliph in
Yeah.
1258,
Yeah.
that it puts Islamic civilization into a kind of existential crisis. If this can happen, what does that mean about the structure of existence, right? Because we have lived for all of these centuries in an Islamic world in which the world, everything we interact with can be called Islam. But how do we cope with this? Now, Juvayni, one of the Mongol historians, does his best to calm them down, right? His audience, he's writing for the Mongols, but his audiences are Muslim.
Yeah.
He does this in interesting ways by talking about how Genghis Khan, he's not Muslim, but he's kind of like a Muslim, He doesn't practice Sharia, but he has the Yasa.
Yeah.
He is just in his own way, so it's okay, right? We can follow, don't rebel. Don't rebel, it's all going to be fine. We Muslims can be ruled by Mongols. But the thing he does, and it is important for the continuation of Islam, is he says, this is God's plan. God sent Genghis Khan to punish us. Now, that sounds terrible, but what it does for those who are in crisis is to put
Calm them
Genghis
down,
Khan back into God's plan.
Yeah.
It's not a catastrophe if this is part of what God wants for us.
Yeah. It's like maybe the older version of colonialism, that somehow you just live with the fact that you're inferior.
That's right.
You did something wrong. That's why you deserve it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We were created better than you.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're here to help.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what ends up happening after this, though, is that Islam now enters into this sort of not quite level playing field, but becomes a contender with neighboring religions, right? With this overlap in geography of Christianity and some Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and all of these things that exist within the Mongol realm. Islam is now one of those, right? And so it takes some time to recover from this.
But did it go ever back to the previous system after the Chingisid rule? I mean, Amir Timur claimed to be, the Amir, the protector of the commander of faith,
Well, in some places, yes. In some places, there's a return to a kind of, but it never returns to this sort of, I mean, as a historian, I can't use the word golden age, but this period in which there is, I mean, even in the Abbasid period, they're not unified, but this sort of is an unmitigated catastrophe with the Mongols, and that recovery means that there never is again really this widespread unity of organizational structure amongst Islamic civilizations, and so. But Islam, because it's not just religion, it's culture and language and architecture and everything, it has a very powerful effect on Mongols and anybody else who encountered this world at the time. I mean, Mongols are now, by the middle of the 13th century, the end of the 13th century, they are the rulers of the two most advanced civilizations in the world, the Chinese and Islamic civilizations. So, of course, it's not to say that we should see them as being conquered by their subjects, but in fact, they probably embraced this in many ways. I mean, why would we want to conquer this civilizations except to make it ours? So, that change in identity, what Mongols are, how they think of themselves, is constantly, again, this like moving target. And, by the time we get through this period in which some of them are converting to religions locally. Kublai is the only one of the Yuan ruling Mongols who even attempts to act Mongol, right? I mean, basically all of his descendants fully embrace their role as a Chinese emperor. Right? They don't go off and live in a yurt occasionally in order to please this conservative faction of Mongols. One thing I want to bring up before I leave this is that all of this division we're talking about, all of this split from unification, there's one interesting fact that continues that would sort of serve as a counter-argument to all of this, and that right up to the end of the Yuan period, that is, right up to the beginning of the 15th century, the Mongols continue to share sources of wealth amongst the descendants of Genghis Khan.
Mm-hmm.
It's said that somewhere up to 33,000 claimants on wealth produced by the Yuan were actually being annually sent to other places in Eurasia, to Chingisids, as their hereditary claim on this collective conquest under Genghis Khan. And part of what brought them together was that Genghis Khan shared the wealth.
Okay.
So even all those
It helped
years
them
later-
preserve and stay in power. To some
It did. I
extent.
mean, to some extent, you have to. If you're going to make the claim to be a great Khan, you better act like it. And that is sharing the wealth. But yet, long after anyone's making a claim to being Khan, they're still making payments to the hereditary descendants of those original Mongols. So this is something interesting, right? That they're still, to undermine what I've just said about identity and how they thought of themselves, there's still this idea that they share something, right? That something is being shared here, and goes back to this idea that what I think the Mongols were really doing from the time of Genghis Khan himself is building a business empire, right? That even in all of these centuries later, they've lost all other connections except for that idea that they share in the wealth of their conquest.
Coming back to the topic of relevance of this period of time, if we just conclude the session with, is especially for a lot of students who wants to study history, maybe it's good to just give them an example. Like, look, we can look at the Mongol period as something is still connected to the modern history. But especially in how it is taught in schools, and they have different memories of how reading. One of the Kazakhs, when I arrived here, not a student here, but outside, when they asked me, like, what do you want to do, I said, I'm going to do research about Central Asian history, more related to Bukhara and the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. And he said, what about Genghis Khan? Have you read about him? And I said, yeah. And the next question he asked was he Kazakh?
Yes.
Yeah. So somehow the necessity to talk about the existence of different groups in the past and how they transformed into different identities is maybe something that we can always talk
Agreed.
about. Yeah.
This is one of the things that I often, look, when I teach courses called the Mongol Empire, everyone wants to come, but they come with this basically this popular idea about what it is, and much of that comes from their own lineage, right? And the real challenge, of course, is that it's complicated. This is one of the things about professional history versus popular history, is that the real story is even better than the popular one, but it takes work. Right? And while we can, I said at the beginning, it's quite hard to study Genghis Khan. You can't compare him to anyone, right? He really does stand out against all of my inclinations about great man history and violent, powerful men and all of this stuff that sort of plagues, the practice of history in the last 2 centuries. Genghis Khan is one of those people. He stands out as being singular because of his time, because of his decisions, because of what he set in motion. And so when you study him, it's you quickly find it's quite difficult to make a rational judgment about something when you can't compare it to anything else. Right? How do you explain this thing without sounding like a panegyrist, that you are praising, and this is one of the things that easily finds its way into popular history, is that Genghis Khan was this demigod. And that's one of the challenges, right? Everyone wants to lay claim on him. He's ours. We are his. And this is the biggest challenge, especially in Central Asia, teaching this. The problem is emphasized by this, recent 30 years ago, we're all turning to this new national identity. We're now free to choose Genghis Khan as our
national
origin.
hero or origin, yeah.
And with it comes this torrent of ideas about the Mongols, about Genghis Khan, about our connections.
It looks like the Chingisid legacy lives on in itself, like it's not really dead. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the program, the fact that people in Afghanistan, in the part of the constitution of Afghanistan, refers to the concepts like jirga and ulus, calling the parliament as ulus,
That's right.
shows that the Chingisid legacy has a larger impact than we could imagine.
Indeed. And I think that the way this conversation has gone is actually quite exemplary, quite a good example of why we should study this history. One, we've talked a lot about identity. Right? I mean, identity is something that is of interest to everyone. Everyone has an identity that they choose, right? They have many options when you're trying to understand your own identity. By studying the Mongol Empire, we not only get, or not the Mongol Empire, studying the Mongols and their legacy gives us a way to understand the development of certain kinds of identity, not just for those who are descended, and not just Central Asians, but concepts about identity and change. Looking at the Mongols and their rule over such a long period of time, we see structures that don't fit with the colonial period, that don't fit with the period of nation states, but yet can be argued to be on that continuum that you mentioned, that they evolved into these other things. The remnants remain from that period. One of the things about studying human behavior, which is what historians do, we study human behavior, is trying to figure out the ways that people organize themselves. That includes identity. That includes political structures. It includes claims of authority, legitimate use of that authority. By looking back to something that is both as simple as a single man, this all starts with Temujin in a way. No doubt that he was influenced by many things, but he stands out. We can more easily come to terms with some of these concepts, right? Studying the Mongol Empire is not about the Mongols. Right? It's about our understanding of
The past.
the past, right? And the challenges that come with studying the Mongol Empire are significant. Yet, we've been talking about this nonstop for 8 centuries, and there's still much we don't understand. So that should entice some potential historians, right? The final thing I'll say about this is that, this doesn't apply just to the Mongols, but history is everyone's business. And everyone has some sense of what it means to understand the past.
Yeah, to understand ourselves.
That's right. Everyone knows something about the past, no matter how they got it. Now, we as professional historians, we have the same kind of interest. It's just that we're applying a set of learned skills. We have a bigger toolbox, right? We have gathered more tools, and we are more trained craftsmen in this. But yet, it's still a field of study and a way of looking at human behavior that has immediate relevance for everyone. And so, this is the great joy of being a historian, is that I can talk to anyone about what I do, and there's a connection, right? Immediately a connection.